5 years ago, I purchased my dream home specifically because of the natural pond in the backyard. The previous owners had started some basic landscaping around it, but I saw the incredible potential the moment we toured the property. The realtor mentioned how rare it was to find a private water feature like this, and I knew I had to have it. The rest of the house could have been a complete disaster, and I still would have bought this property for that pond alone. The water reflected the sky like a perfect mirror, surrounded by native grasses and wildflowers. It measured about 30 feet across at its widest point and went down nearly 6 feet deep in the center. A few water lilies dotted the surface, but I could envision so much more. I signed the closing documents with excitement, already planning the transformation in my mind. Over the next several years, I poured my heart, soul, and savings into creating a backyard sanctuary. I added a stone pathway around the perimeter, installed proper filtration systems to keep the water clear, and strategically placed large boulders for both aesthetic appeal and natural seating. I researched aquatic plants extensively before introducing water lilies, lotus flowers, and cattails in careful balance. The crowning achievement came when I added a collection of beautiful koi fish that quickly became like pets to me. Every evening after work, I would sit beside the pond, watching the fish swim gracefully beneath the surface, their orange, white, and black scales glinting in the fatting sunlight. The gentle splashing of the small waterfall I had installed created the perfect white noise to wash away the stress of the day. Birds, butterflies, and even the occasional friendly turtle made appearances, turning my backyard into a miniature ecosystem that thrived under my careful stewardship. The neighbors would occasionally compliment my pond from afar. Mrs. Johnson, whose property bordered mine to the east, often commented on how the sound of the water helped her sleep at night with her window open. Mr. Peterson, a retired landscaper himself, would stop by occasionally to admire the work and offer friendly advice about seasonal care for the aquatic plants. It was a peaceful coexistence with clear boundaries. They enjoyed the view from a respectful distance, and I was happy to have created something beautiful that enhanced the neighborhood. That harmonious relationship with my neighbors remained intact until about 18 months ago when someone proposed forming a homeowners association. The main selling point was increased property values and standardized maintenance of common areas like the front entrance and the small playground at the end of the street. I reluctantly signed the agreement, figuring it would be a minor inconvenience at worst. The initial dues seemed reasonable at just $150 per quarter, and the first board consisted of sensible, long-time residents who understood the balance between community standards and personal freedom. The trouble began 6 months ago with the annual board election. Most of the original members stepped down, claiming time constraints and other commitments. A new group swept into power, led by Karen Mitchell, who had moved into the neighborhood less than a year prior. Her campaign focused on elevating community standards and maximizing property values through uniformity and shared amenities. I paid little attention to the political shift, foolishly believing it would not affect me directly. I continued to care for my pond, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the HOA boardroom. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs. The way Karen would slow her morning walks when passing my house. How she would stand at the edge of my property, staring at the pond with calculating eyes. The whispered conversations with other board members that abruptly stopped when I approached. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. Karen Mitchell moved into our neighborhood after selling her previous home in an upscale gated community across town. Rumors circulated that she had served as HOA president there as well, eventually stepping down amid controversy over excessive fines and overreach of authority. She carried herself with an air of superiority, from her perfectly maintained blonde bob haircut to her luxury SUV that was always immaculately clean despite Michigan winters. Karen worked as a mid-level manager at a pharmaceutical company, but she wielded her HOA authority as if she were the CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation. The first mandatory HOA meeting under the new board took place in our community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that had previously been used mainly for holiday gatherings and the occasional yard sale on rainy days. The room was uncomfortably warm as residents filled the metal folding chairs. I sat near the back, planning to leave early if possible. Karen stood at the podium wearing a crisp blue blazer, her posture rigid as she called the meeting to order. "We have exciting initiatives planned for our community," Karen announced, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that seemed unnecessarily professional for our small neighborhood association. "Our focus this quarter will be on community beautification and expanding shared amenities for all residents to enjoy." My attention drifted until one particular slide appeared on the screen. It showed an aerial view of our neighborhood with certain areas highlighted in blue. I squinted, trying to make sense of the markings. One blue section appeared to be in the vicinity of my property. Karen continued speaking, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "We are particularly interested in developing water features and natural areas for community gatherings. Research shows that access to blue spaces significantly increases property values." After the meeting, I approached Karen to ask about the highlighted areas on the map, but she was surrounded by enthusiastic board members and waved me off with a promise to circle back later. I left feeling uneasy, but unable to pinpoint exactly why. The following week, I noticed increased foot traffic along the edge of my property. Neighbors who had never shown interest in my pond before were suddenly walking by multiple times a day, sometimes stopping to point or take photos with their phones. Then came the day I arrived home from work to find Karen leading what appeared to be a small tour of board members along my property line, gesturing toward my pond as they nodded and took notes. I confronted them immediately. "Can I help you with something?" Karen turned with practiced poise. "Just discussing some community enhancement options. Your pond is quite the neighborhood gem." "Thank you, I have put a lot of work into it." I emphasized the word "I" pointedly. "That is exactly what we wanted to talk to you about. The board feels this beautiful water feature could benefit everyone. We will be in touch formally." She smiled and led the group away before I could respond. 3 days later, an official letter arrived in my mailbox. The HOA letterhead looked unnecessarily formal with its gold embossing and watermark. I opened it standing in my driveway, reading with increasing disbelief. "Dear homeowner, it has come to the attention of the board that the water feature located on your property is technically situated within a common area as defined by the original subdivision plat. As such, the HOA is exercising its right to reclaim this space for community use." My hands shook as I read the rest of the letter, which detailed plans for community access and shared maintenance responsibilities. The absurdity of their claim sent me straight to my filing cabinet, where I dug out my property deed, survey documents, and the original closing paperwork. I spread everything across my kitchen table, confirming what I already knew. The pond was entirely within my property boundaries, not even close to any easement or common area. Armed with documentation, I marched to Karen's house the next morning. She answered the door in workout clothes, appearing annoyed at the interruption. "I have all the documentation showing the pond is on my private property," I stated, holding out the survey map with property lines clearly marked. "There must be some misunderstanding with the board." Karen barely glanced at the papers before taking them with manicured fingers. The board will need to review these documents and compare them with the original subdivision plat. We will get back to you after our assessment. Her tone was dismissive as she placed my evidence into a folder without truly examining it. "How long will that take?" I asked. "The board meets again in 2 weeks. We will address it then. In the meantime, please do not make any changes to the area in question." She closed the door before I could protest further. I stood on her porch, stunned by the interaction. Something told me that Karen had no intention of actually reviewing my documentation. This was about power, not property lines, and it was becoming increasingly clear that I was up against someone who knew how to manipulate the system to get what she wanted. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next month. I returned home from work one evening to find a family I had never seen before having a picnic at the edge of my pond. Their children were throwing bread into the water, disrupting the careful ecosystem I had maintained. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. "This is private property." The mother looked up with mild surprise. "Oh, we were told this was a community area now. The HOA president said everyone is welcome to enjoy the pond." My stomach tightened. "I am afraid you have been misinformed. This is my backyard and the pond is on my private property." The father stood up, looking uncomfortable. "We do not want any trouble. Karen specifically told us at the last meeting that this was designated as community property now. She even suggested we come enjoy it." I maintained my composure as they gathered their things and left, but inside I was seething. Over the following weeks, similar incidents multiplied. I would find unfamiliar footprints around the pond edge, trash floating in the water, and lawn chairs occasionally left behind. One morning, I discovered that 2 of my largest koi fish were missing. Whether they had been taken or simply died from the bread and other inappropriate foods being thrown into the pond, I could not be sure. The damage to my carefully cultivated landscaping became increasingly evident. Trampled plants, broken branches on ornamental shrubs, and even cigarette butts floating in the water became common sights. I installed a security camera aimed at the pond and posted a small, private property sign, which mysteriously disappeared within 24 hours. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community center. I arrived early, bringing my property documents in a labeled folder. The room filled quickly, and I noticed several neighbors avoiding eye contact with me. Karen called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. After handling routine business, Karen proceeded to the special projects portion of the agenda. A projector flickered to life, displaying a large image of my pond with the label Community Waterfront Development emblazoned across the top. "As many of you know, we have identified a significant community asset that has been underutilized," Karen began, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "The board has officially designated the pond area as community property based on our review of the original subdivision documents." I stood up immediately. "That is absolutely false. I have the deed and survey proving the pond is entirely within my property boundaries." Karen continued as if I had not spoken. "We have developed a comprehensive plan for enhancing this space with community access paths, benches, and a small dock for fishing and wildlife observation." She clicked to the next slide, showing architectural renderings of my transformed backyard. "The estimated cost will be shared among all homeowners, with a slightly higher assessment for those whose properties directly benefit from proximity to the water feature." The room buzzed with excitement as neighbors volunteered for various pond committees. I raised my voice above the chatter. "This is illegal. You cannot claim private property as community space." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. Karen's smile tightened. "The board has reviewed the documentation and made its determination. If you continue to obstruct community access, you will be in violation of HOA bylaws." "I never agreed to give up my property rights when I joined the HOA," I protested. A board member I recognized as Karen's next-door neighbor stood up. "The bylaws clearly state that the association has authority over common areas as defined by the board. We have voted unanimously that this water feature qualifies as a common area." Before I could respond, Karen called for a vote on implementing fines for homeowners who obstruct community access to shared amenities. The measure passed with only my dissenting vote. The meeting adjourned with Karen announcing the first official Community Pond Day scheduled for the following weekend. I left the meeting in a state of disbelief. How could they simply declare my property to be community property? The next morning, I contacted a real estate attorney recommended by a colleague at work. Jennifer Rossi had experience dealing with HOA disputes and agreed to see me that afternoon. Ms. Rossi's office provided a welcome contrast to the chaotic community meeting. The space was professional, calm, and organized. I spread my documentation across her desk: property deed, survey, plot maps, and the threatening letters from the HOA. After reviewing everything carefully, Ms. Rossi looked up with absolute certainty in her eyes. "They do not have a legal leg to stand on. The pond is clearly within your property boundaries. No HOA has the authority to simply claim private property as common area, regardless of what their bylaws might suggest." "Then why are they doing this?" I asked. "Unfortunately, many HOA boards count on homeowners not knowing their rights or being unwilling to fight. They use intimidation and the threat of fines to get compliance." She began drafting a letter on her computer. "We will send a formal cease and desist letter outlining the legal boundaries and demanding they stop claiming rights to your property." I felt a moment of relief knowing the law was on my side. But as I would soon discover, having legal right did not always translate to immediate justice. The battle for my pond was just beginning, and Karen had no intention of backing down without a fight. The cease and desist letter from my attorney was delivered to each HOA board member by certified mail. It clearly outlined my property rights, included copies of the relevant surveys and deeds, and demanded an immediate end to all claims that my pond was community property. The letter also required written acknowledgement from the board within 5 business days. No response came within the specified time frame. Instead, on the 4th day, bright blue flyers appeared in every mailbox in the neighborhood. "Community Pond Day," they proclaimed in cheerful font. "Join us this Saturday for the official opening of our neighborhood pond. Activities include fishing, a picnic lunch, and planning session for future improvements." I called Ms. Rossi immediately. "They are ignoring the legal notice completely." "Document everything," she advised. "Take photos of the flyers, record any trespassing incidents, and call the police if necessary. We are building a case." Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, which only added to my anxiety. I had taken the day off work to protect my property, uncertain of what would unfold. Around 10 a.m., I heard voices and looked out my window to see Karen and at least 15 neighbors gathering at the edge of my yard. Karen wore a pond committee badge and carried a clipboard. Someone was setting up a folding table with refreshments. I stepped outside, my heart pounding. "Excuse me. This is private property and you are all trespassing." Karen turned to address the group instead of me. As I was explaining, The community pond area extends from the water's edge to approximately where I am standing. The HOA has confirmed this with county records. That is completely false, I stated loudly enough for everyone to hear. My attorney has sent official notice that this pond is private property. I have the survey and deed to prove it. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, but Karen maintained her composure. The association has reviewed all relevant documents and made its determination. Now, as I was saying, the first phase of improvements will include a gravel pathway around the water. Everyone needs to leave now, I insisted, pulling out my phone. This is trespassing, and I will call the police if necessary. Karen's pleasant facade cracked slightly. You are being unreasonable and selfish. This is about enhancing our community. This is about respecting private property rights, I countered. Please leave now. Slowly, some neighbors began to drift away, looking confused and embarrassed. Karen noticed the group thinning and changed tactics. Fine, we will continue our planning meeting at the community center, but this issue is not resolved. As the impromptu gathering disbanded, Karen stopped directly in front of me. You are making a serious mistake. The HOA has ways of dealing with difficult homeowners. True to her word, the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox 3 days later, citing aggressive behavior toward community members and imposing a fine of $200. Over the next 2 weeks, additional notices arrived, each more absurd than the last. Improper pond maintenance, unauthorized signage, referring to my no trespassing sign, and failure to maintain common areas. I refused to pay any of the fines, which only led to additional administrative fees being added to my account. Ms. Rossi advised me to document each notice while she prepared for possible litigation. In a good faith attempt at resolution, I requested a meeting with the full board to discuss a compromise. Perhaps I could allow limited, scheduled access to view the pond from a designated area, provided they acknowledged my property rights and ensured respect for the ecosystem. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at the community center. I arrived with a detailed proposal and even architectural renderings of a small viewing platform I was willing to install at my own expense near the property line. Karen and the other board members sat behind a long table elevated on a small platform at the front of the room, literally looking down on me as I presented my compromise solution. I kept my tone reasonable and emphasized my willingness to work with the community while protecting my property rights. When I finished speaking, there was a brief silence before Karen responded. While we appreciate your creative approach, the board has already determined that the pond area falls within community boundaries. We are not interested in compromises that restrict rightful access to common areas. Another board member, a man I barely knew named Richard, leaned forward. Furthermore, your continued obstruction has forced the board to consider legal action. Either you comply with community standards regarding common areas, or we will be forced to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines and pursue injunctive relief through the courts. I looked from face to face, seeing not a hint of compromise or reason. So you are threatening to sue me for protecting my private property. We are informing you of the consequences of continued noncompliance with HOA regulations, Karen replied coolly. The choice is yours. I gathered my presentation materials and stood to leave. I think we are done here. As I walked out into the cool evening air, I knew a line had been crossed. Reasonable discussion had failed. Compromise had been rejected. Legal notices had been ignored. It was time to consider more dramatic measures to protect what was rightfully mine. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. I was working in my home office when movement near the pond caught my eye. Through the window, I spotted 3 children, none older than 10, standing at the edge of my pond with fishing poles. No adults were in sight. The danger of unsupervised children around deep water sent a chill through me. I rushed outside immediately. "Where are your parents?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite my alarm. The oldest boy shrugged. "At home. Mrs. Mitchell said we could fish here whenever we want. She said it is community property now." I escorted the children to the edge of my yard and watched them walk down the street. The realization that Karen was now encouraging unsupervised children to trespass on my property, creating both a safety hazard and liability nightmare, crystallized something in my mind. This situation had become untenable and potentially dangerous. The next morning, I called Ms. Rossi and arranged another meeting. In her office, I laid out the escalating situation and asked about my legal options for more immediate action. Legal proceedings against the HOA could take months, possibly years, she explained. And during that time, they will continue to harass you with fines and possibly liens. What about my rights as a property owner? Can I not control what happens on my own land? I asked, frustration evident in my voice. Ms. Rossi leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Actually, you have more options than you might think. While they are trying to claim your property, they cannot actually stop you from modifying your own land, provided you stay within county regulations." "What do you mean by modifying?" I asked. "I mean you own the land. If you wanted to, say, change your landscaping dramatically, that would be your right. Many HOAs have restrictions on front yards, but backyards typically have fewer restrictions, especially regarding natural landscaping." This conversation sparked an idea that grew into a plan over the following days. I consulted not only with my attorney, but also with an environmental engineer and a landscaping expert specializing in native plants. The environmental engineer confirmed that, as the property owner, I had the right to modify or even remove the pond, provided I followed proper environmental procedures for wildlife relocation and water drainage. The landscaping expert introduced me to the concept of defensive landscaping using native plants. Thorny bushes like barberry, hawthorn, pyracantha, and native roses create effective natural barriers while also providing ecological benefits, she explained, showing me photographs of the plants in various seasons. They are beautiful, low maintenance, drought-resistant, and completely legal. I spent evenings researching county ordinances, HOA bylaws, and environmental regulations. The more I researched, the more confident I became in my plan. The HOA bylaws had restrictions against certain front yard modifications, but said very little about backyards beyond general maintenance requirements. There was nothing that could prevent me from removing the pond and replacing it with native landscaping. The environmental engineer helped me develop a proper plan for draining the pond that would comply with all regulations. "We will need to obtain permits for the drainage work," she explained. "But with proper documentation showing you are the property owner, that should not be a problem." I visited the county offices with my property deed and survey in hand. The clerk seemed confused by my request at first. "You want to drain your own pond. Most people are trying to add water features, not remove them." "I am converting to a native garden that will be more sustainable and require less maintenance," I explained, which was technically true. After submitting the necessary paperwork and paying the required fees, I received approval for landscape renovation including water feature removal within 2 weeks. The permit would be valid for 90 days, giving me plenty of time to coordinate the various professionals I would need. Next came the most satisfying part of the planning, selecting the thorny plants that would replace my beloved pond. I chose a mix of native species that would provide year-round interest while forming an impenetrable barrier. Barberry bushes with their sharp thorns and red berries. Hawthorn tree that would eventually grow to provide shade with their protective thorny branches. Pyracantha, firethorn, with brilliant orange berries in fall but vicious thorns year-round. Native blackberry bushes that would produce fruit while creating a thorny thicket. Rosa rugosa, a hardy native rose species with thick thorns and beautiful flowers. The landscaper helped me create a geometric planting plan that would be aesthetically pleasing when viewed from above or from a distance, but would create an impassable barrier up close. The plants would be arranged in concentric rings where the pond had been, with a variety of heights and seasonal interest. Finally, I contacted a company specializing in pond drainage and fish relocation. My friend Thomas, who lived several miles away in a different neighborhood, had agreed to adopt my koi fish and other pond wildlife into his large backyard pond. The drainage experts assured me they could handle the process humanely and efficiently. As all the pieces fell into place, I set a date for the transformation, Tuesday of the following week, when most of the HOA board members would be at work. I took the day off and prepared for what would be a bittersweet but necessary change. Tuesday morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the task ahead. I woke before sunrise, taking one last moment to sit beside my pond in the dim morning light. The water reflected the fatting stars and first hints of dawn. My koi fish, sensing my presence, gathered near the edge as they had done countless mornings when I brought their food. I felt a pang of sadness knowing I would never see this particular view again, but my resolve remained unshaken. At precisely 7 o'clock, the first truck arrived. The drainage team consisted of 4 professionals who clearly knew their business. The supervisor, a woman named Maria with 20 years of experience, reviewed the permits and plan with me one final time. "We will work systematically," she explained. "First, we capture and relocate all visible wildlife. Then we begin the gradual drainage, continuing to monitor for any animals we might have missed. The water will be pumped through these filtration systems before being directed to the storm drain, ensuring no contaminants enter the municipal system." I watched as the team set up their equipment with practiced efficiency. Large tanks with aeration systems stood ready to temporarily house my fish and other aquatic creatures. Special nets and containers were prepared for the various frogs, turtles, and other small wildlife that had made my pond their home. The wildlife collection process was handled with surprising gentleness. Each koi fish was carefully netted and placed in the aerated holding tanks. The team found 3 turtles, numerous frogs, and countless smaller organisms that would all be relocated. By mid-morning, all visible wildlife had been secured in appropriate temporary habitats, and the drainage process began. Large hoses snaked from the pond to filtration equipment and then to the street, where they connected to the storm drainage system as permitted by the county. The pumps hummed to life, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the water level began to drop. As the morning progressed, I noticed occasional cars slowing as they passed my house. A few neighbors walked by, stopping to stare openly at the activity in my yard. No one approached to ask questions, but I could see phones coming out to take pictures or make calls. I imagined Karen's phone ringing constantly with reports from her neighborhood surveillance network. By noon, the pond had drained enough to reveal features that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. Old rocks, the remnants of the original pond liner in places, and the contours of the basin all emerged like an archaeological discovery. The team continued the careful drainage, now using smaller pumps to remove water from the deeper pockets while checking for any remaining wildlife. My friend Thomas arrived with a truck around 1 o'clock to transport the rescued pond inhabitants to their new home. The fish and other creatures were carefully transferred to his transportation tanks with proper aeration. We spoke briefly about the situation, and he shook his head in disbelief at the HOA's behavior. "Their loss is my gain," he said. "These are beautiful koi. They will have a good home with me, and you are welcome to visit them any time." As Thomas drove away with my aquatic friends, the landscaping crew arrived with a small bulldozer and several trucks loaded with plants. The foreman, a burly man named Steve, reviewed the planting plan with me. "We will reshape the basin slightly to ensure proper drainage, then begin placing the larger specimens according to the diagram. By sunset, you will have a completely different landscape." The transformation accelerated throughout the afternoon. The drainage team finished their work and departed. The landscapers reshaped the basin, added specific soil amendments for the new plants, and began the systematic installation of the thorny barrier. Larger hawthorn trees were positioned first, followed by strategic groupings of barberry and pyracantha. The native roses and blackberry bushes would fill in gaps and create an even more impenetrable barrier over time. Around 3 o'clock, I noticed the first HOA board members driving slowly past my house. Karen's luxury SUV crawled by twice within an hour, but she did not stop or approach. Other neighbors were less restrained, gathering in small groups at the edge of my property, with expressions ranging from curiosity to obvious disapproval. As the day waned, the landscapers installed the final element of my plan, a series of tasteful but unmistakable private property, no trespassing signs at regular intervals along my property line. The signs were legal according to county regulations and not specifically prohibited by HOA bylaws for backyard use. By sunset, the transformation was complete. Where my beautiful pond had once reflected the sky, a geometric arrangement of thorny but aesthetically pleasing native plants now stood. From above or from a distance, the concentric rings of different species created an attractive pattern. But up close, the message was clear. This area was no longer accessible. I stood at my back window as darkness fell, watching the last trucks depart. The new landscape was foreign to me now, but I knew that in time it would develop its own beauty. More importantly, it had accomplished exactly what I intended. The community pond no longer existed. The reaction was swift and predictable. By Wednesday morning, an emergency HOA meeting notice had been slipped under my door, scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening. The paper trembled slightly in my hand, not from fear but from anticipation. For the first time in this ordeal, I felt completely in control. I called Ms. Rossi immediately. "They have called an emergency meeting for tonight. Would you be able to attend with me?" "I would not miss it," she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Bring all the permits and documentation." That evening, the community center was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Neighbors who rarely attended meetings had shown up, clearly drawn by the gossip about my dramatic property transformation. Karen and the board members sat at their elevated table, faces grim. I took a seat in the front row, my attorney beside me with a briefcase full of documentation. Karen called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "This emergency session has been called to address the willful destruction of community property by a homeowner." Her gaze fixed on me with undisguised hostility. "Yesterday, without notice or approval, the community pond was drained and destroyed." Ms. Rossi and I remained calmly seated as Karen continued her diatribe, describing my actions as environmental vandalism and community sabotage. She outlined potential legal actions the HOA could take, including substantial fines, liens, and even a lawsuit for restoration of the community asset. When Karen finally paused for breath, Ms. Rossi stood. "If I may address the board and community members present, my name is Jennifer Rossi, attorney at law representing the homeowner." Karen seemed momentarily taken aback by the professional intervention, but nodded stiffly. "What occurred yesterday was entirely legal and properly permitted," Ms. Rossi began, her voice clear and confident. She placed copies of the permits and approvals on the table. "My client modified landscaping on private property, following all county regulations and environmental requirements. That pond was designated as community property by board vote," Richard interjected. "A board vote cannot override legal property boundaries," Ms. Rossi countered. "I have here the property deed, survey, and county records clearly showing the pond was located entirely within my client's property lines. Additionally, I have documentation of our multiple attempts to clarify this matter legally, including a cease and desist letter that was ignored by this board." She proceeded to distribute copies of all relevant documentation to board members and interested neighbors. Furthermore, the wildlife was humanely relocated, the water properly filtered during drainage, and the new plants are all native species beneficial to the local ecosystem. A neighbor I recognized as Mrs. Johnson raised her hand. "We were told the pond was in a common area according to the original subdivision plan. Is that not true?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. "The board reviewed the relevant documents and made a determination." "May we see these documents?" Mrs. Johnson pressed. After an uncomfortable pause, Richard admitted, "The specific documents are still under review with our HOA attorney." Ms. Rossi seized the opening. "In other words, the board has been claiming community ownership without actual documentation to support it, while ignoring clear evidence to the contrary. This raises serious questions about the board's conduct and possible liability for encouraging trespassing on private property." The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. Neighbors began whispering among themselves, many looking at Karen with newfound suspicion. Questions came from all directions. Were we misled about the pond being community property? Have we been paying for legal advice that was ignored? What other decisions have been made without proper documentation? The meeting devolved into chaos as Karen struggled to maintain control. Eventually, she was forced to adjourn without any action items or votes on penalties. As people filed out, several stopped to apologize to me personally for the misunderstanding. Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation took place in our community. A petition circulated calling for a special election to replace the board. Karen and her allies resigned rather than face a public vote. New board members were elected, including Mrs. Johnson, who had become one of my strongest supporters after realizing how she had been misled. The new board approached me respectfully about neighborhood concerns, always acknowledging property boundaries and rights. The confrontational atmosphere that had poisoned our community began to heal.